Balerion the Dread. The beast that Aegon rode across the sea. Its flames forged.
Hey there guys, this is your host Richard with another marvelous video. It's pretty ironic that the single most identifiable thing about George R.R. Martin's fantasy magnum opus is something he was debating including in it in the first place. There are other magical creatures on the continents of Planetos, but the one that inspires awe and terror within all is the dragon. Dragons are so intricately tied into the history and future of the series that we've got a whole damn show named after them. But the House of the Dragon couldn't have forged the Iron Throne without the presence of one dragon. And we mean that literally. Balerion the Black Dread earned his epithet as the creature that united the Western world. The largest Targaryen dragon in history, he was undefeated in battle, and by the time Aegon was coroneted, he'd become synonymous with Targaryen power. Balerion's impact on the world of ice and fire was such that his legacy is being carried forward till this day. So in this video, we're going to take a look at his entire life and find out just what it means to be the greatest known dragon of all time. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Birth and formative years. The only Targaryen dragon that saw Valyria. George R.R. Martin is a man that doesn't like giving out dates, partly because that ruins the mystique of his series, and partly because, well, he can't be asked to come up with a formal timeline. Martin is a gardener-type writer who comes up with details and stories in the flow of work, and then works around whatever his brain's cooked up to make it sense. But he's also a realist, in that he takes a rather historiographical approach to the Song of Ice and Fire series. Things like world books and compendiums are important reading, and the fog of history blankets all of it. Martin repeatedly tells us that whatever we read in things like A World of Ice and Fire, or the Dunk and Egg novellas, or the Fire and Blood books, is to be taken with a grain of salt, because it's written from the perspective of Westerosi maesters. Taking that into consideration, it's no wonder that there's no record of the year in which the greatest Targaryen dragon in history was born. But there could be another reason for that. That being the place where Balerion was born. Of the dozens of dragons that have been associated with Targaryen power over the centuries, only one has originated from the source of it all, and that's Balerion. The Black Dread was born back when old Valyria still stood, and the 14 Flames hadn't split the peninsula into so many pieces. Dragons are not a homogenized species in Martin's world. They have their dedicated subspecies types, where they're clearly divided on the basis of swiftness and strength. Swift dragons are lean, lithe, and move much faster than you'd expect a creature of their size to. Strength dragons are massive, weighty, and possess flames that can melt pretty much anything standing in its path. The stronger a dragon is, the more effective its flame becomes, and some dragons shoot streams of fire where others spit fireballs. But all dragons begin life as an egg. The color of an egg is indicative of the coloring of the dragon, which we learnt when we saw Daenerys' dragon eggs hatch. The dragon Viserion was born from an egg which had pale cream coloring, streaked through with gold. The dragon Rhaegal was born from a jade green egg, flecked with bronze that came and went as it was turned in one's hands. And the dragon Drogon was born from an egg as black as the midnight sea, alive with scarlet ripples and swirls. Drogon is often called the second coming of Balerion, because his coloring is an exact match for the legendary dragons, which means his egg must have looked pretty similar. But unlike Drogon's birth, which involved a lot of grief and tragedy and figuring out the process through feel and prophecy, Valerion's birth took place in the controlled ecosystem of the Valyrian Peninsula, where dragons were bred like war machines. The 14 Flames created the perfect incubation environment for them, and besides, the Valyrians knew how to use sorcery at this point in time, unlike the main timeline of Ice and Fire, where characters are pretty much figuring things out as they go. The Black Dread must have spent a few years in the heart of the Freehold, because though they weren't powerful, the Targaryens were landholders and dragon lords. The Valyrian Freehold was a complicated web of hierarchies, bloodlines, and religion. Instead of concentrating power in the hands of one ruler, they had a Freehold Council, comprised of every Valyrian family that could tame and control dragons. Amongst these families, the Targaryens ranked in the bottom third, so it's safe to say that none of the higher families could have foreseen the future of young Balerion. They didn't know that this hatchling would go on to become the biggest monument to their legacy as conquerors, which is probably why they scoffed at the Targaryens when they decided to leave the Freehold 114 years before Conquest. Dragons grow in size based on the amount of food and freedom they're given. Daenerys' dragons are barely active for 2 years, and she can already ride Drogon like a stallion. Even if Balerion's growth rate was faster than that, he'd have to spend at least a year in Valyria, and that kind of upbringing tends to stay in a young dragon's mind. We'll get back to what we mean by that in a few sections. But after spending his formative years as the Scarlet and Onyx hatchling of one of the weakest dragon lords in the world, Balerion and 4 of his kin moved from the lands of always summer to the land where winter awaits. Relocation to Dragonstone and the Century of Blood. Balerion arrives in Westeros. At the time of Balerion's birth, the patriarch of the Targaryen family was Aegon Targaryen. Like any good Valyrian, Aegon had multiple wives, and we're sure he had several children with them. However, only one of them is relevant to this video and Balerion's life, and that's his daughter, Daenys. Called the Dreamer for her powerful prophetic dreams, Daenys foresaw the doom of Valyria several years before it was set to occur. She witnessed the fiery inferno that would spew forth from the 14 flames and turn Valyria's skies to smoke and seas to ash. She saw the dragons get burnt out of the sky and fall on the many topless towers that adorn that fabled city's landscape. You might be thinking that constructing topless towers in a volcano-centric civilization was a dumb idea. You have to consider the fact that the Valyrians never anticipated getting wiped out like that, let alone in a single night. Either they were highly ignorant of the fates or they were arrogant enough to think they could avert it. But neither is a good look for a civilization whose bread and butter was prophecy and blood magic. The Valyrians had established one of the largest polities in the world over the course of thousands of years, subsuming several cultures and nations within their multicultural freehold. Their northernmost outpost was the city of Lorath, with their southernmost outpost being the city of Gorgossus on Sothorios. Their easternmost outposts extended toward the city of Qarth, and their westernmost outpost, captured some 2 centuries before the Doom, was a tiny island in Blackwater Bay that the Valyrians christened Dragonstone. For some reason, the Dragonlords never quite made an attempt at conquering Westeros during the height of their powers, but they were competent enough rulers to know that they needed an eye and an arm everywhere in the world. And that's what Dragonstone started out as, the Freehold's westernmost eye and arm. From an ecological perspective, the Dragonlords couldn't have asked for a better military base because Dragonstone is a volcanic island. Though it's nowhere near as powerful as the 14 Flames of Valyria, the Dragonmont is hot enough to keep the Dragonlord's dragons comfortable and homely during their stay at the Isle. Perhaps that's what the rest of the Freehold thought Aegon was looking for when he bought the island and sold all his holdings on mainland Valyria. The Targaryen patriarch was dubbed the Exile by his peers, for they thought he'd lost his stomach for conquest and run off to the west with his tail tucked between his legs. They'd be proven horrifyingly wrong 12 years later, when the Doom finally destroys the greatest civilization in the known world. Aegon came to Dragonstone with 5 dragons, but Balerion must have been the youngest, because the other 4 ended up dying. We don't know if this was due to natural causes or infighting in the Targaryen family, but we can assume the former to be more likely because A. Dragons do die of old age, as you'll learn soon enough, and B. Not being able to adapt to a new living habitat is a major contributing factor to any biological creature's death. Valyria, for all its power, only ever deployed dragons from its capital city. There are no records of Valyrians housing dragons permanently anywhere aside from Dragonstone, but that only happens because of Aenar's shift. Balerion must have survived the adjustment because he was a young dragon still, and the Dragonmont's heat was good enough for him to feed and grow into a healthy dragon. As for Aenar's other dragons, they must have gotten so used to the heat of the 14 Flames that by the time they settled on Dragonstone, even the Dragonmont wouldn't have sufficed. We aren't volcanic experts, but something tells us 14 volcanoes create a much hotter ecosystem than just one, and getting used to such a sharp shift, especially if it occurs in old age, is liable to bring a creature closer to the natural end of its life. 12 years into living at his new home, Balerion lost his old one when the Doom finally came to Valyria, a decade after the Targaryens' relocation. This made him one of the last living creatures to have seen Valyria in its prime, and when Aenar and the generation after him died out, he became the only one. It's unclear what Balerion does in the decades following the Doom. During the Century of Blood, the Targaryens are pacifists for the most part, and that they don't directly involve themselves in wars and matters of politics. This might seem like an odd thing for the remnants of the greatest empire in the world to do, but Aenar's kin was smarter than the man who tried to reclaim Valyria after the Doom. A dragon lord called Orion, who had been in Qohor when the Doom occurred, made the daring attempt to reclaim his homeland with 30,000 men and 1 dragon. But when neither reappeared in the annals of history, visiting Valyria was deemed to be madness. Aenar's family knew that they couldn't really retake the world with 5 dragons, 4 of which were likely to die soon, so they bided their time until they had dragons that were battle-worthy. Balerion was a flying age, but he needed a lot more food, freedom and fire to become the legendary Black Dread. So, that's what he does during the Century of Blood. It's unclear who rode Balerion during this time, if he was ridden at all. The Targaryens held Dragonstone for 5 generations before they became belligerent again. It started with Aenar's son Gaemon, who married Daenys the Dreamer and was known as the Glorious throughout his life. Their children, Aegon and Aelena, married each other and birthed 2 sons, out of which one became the direct ancestor of the Aegon Targaryen. It's possible that Balerion was claimed by each Targaryen family head before Aegon, but that's an assumption we don't have enough information on to be making. We know he came to Westeros a rather young dragon, and he would have grown large enough to fly and partake in combat by the time Gaemon the Glorious passed away. Dragons are bred for warfare, so the lack of fighting must have frustrated Balerion to no end. Luckily, he was joined by Meraxes and Vhagar during the Century of Blood. A couple decades after Vhagar's birth, a rider, Visenya, was born, and a couple of years after that, the man most associated with Balerion would come into the world. Aegon Targaryen was born the 7th Lord and heir of Dragonstone, but he broke family tradition and brought dragons back to the field of war. The reason that the century following the destruction of Valyria is called the Century of Blood in Essos is because it was a time when the continent saw some of its most bloody decades. In the aftermath of Valyria's decline, their oldest daughter, Volantis, tried to lay claim to their legacy and launched a campaign to unify all the free cities. The Volantines captured 2 of them, Lys and Myr, with relative ease. These cities were relatively close to the Volantine sphere of influence, so dispatching troops and ships to either of them wasn't much of a problem for them. The problem began when they tried taking a 3rd free city in Tyrosh, and were repelled by a 4th, Pentos. Volantis was undoubtedly the strongest free city in the wake of Valyria's decline. They could have feasibly conquered the western half of Essos if they hadn't been so arrogant about it, but their superior attitudes ended up unifying everyone else against them. However, no other free city had the resources that Volantis had, so they needed to look outside of their own polities for backup. All free cities, with the exception of Braavos, were under Valyrian control at one point, so it isn't a stretch of the imagination to think that they all must have approached the Targaryens with offers of alliances at different points in time. Lys especially was close to the Dragonlord's hearts because it was their pleasure retreat, and many Lysene look like Valyrians even today. But no Targaryens before Aegon got involved with the affairs of the East or the West for reasons that remain unclear till this day. Maybe they didn't want to get involved because they were still grieving the loss of their home. Maybe they were waiting for a certain event to occur, which would then stir them into action. Or maybe they were simply bored of war. Whatever it was, the Targaryens remained neutral through most conflicts in the East and West until the latter involved itself with the former's affairs, and their lord had a dream. The spark of the Conquest, Aegon's dream and Balerion's involvement during its early stages. For a long time, there were several questions surrounding the rather sudden onset of Aegon's conquest. The Targaryens had expressed no desire to rule over Westeros before his birth. They didn't even get involved in external conflicts, choosing to remain in Dragonstone with their relics and their dragons. So why did the 6th generation after Aenar Targaryen choose to break their pacifist stance? Well, thanks to House of the Dragon, we now know it was because of a dream. During the development process of Season 1, the showrunners were looking for a way to bridge the gap between it and Game of Thrones when George dropped the bombshell that it's Aegon's dream upon their heads. Apparently, when he was young, the Conqueror had a dream about the second long night and the role that his house would end up playing in it. He knew that in order to achieve victory, the 7 kingdoms of Westeros needed to become one, which in turn birthed his conquest. Aegon had been preparing for his burden well before he actually began his invasion. After realizing he needed to conquer Westeros to defeat the White Walkers, he commissioned the construction of the Painted Table. This monstrosity of a piece of furniture was carved in the exact shape of the Westerosi landmass, with every mountain, hill, river, valley, nook and cranny etched into it with striking detail and precision. It must have taken years to construct, thanks to the sheer amount of cross-referencing and intricate carving involved. Carpenters would have had to use multiple maps to achieve this feat, and even if the Targaryens used their dragons to help them out, it wouldn't have increased the actual pace of their labor. Once its construction was finished, Aegon needed a pretext to spark conflict on Westerosi lands that didn't make him seem like a bloodthirsty conqueror, like his Valyrian ancestors. He knew that for his plan to work, the people needed to see him as a unifier and a liberator. So, when he heard that the Storm King Argilac Durrandon had involved himself in the war against Volantis, he knew what he had to do. Argilac Durrandon was an exceptionally powerful warrior who led an army that was as disciplined as it was savage. The Storm King set forth from Shipbreaker Bay, landed in the disputed lands and turned back a Volantine force trying to recapture the rebelling city of Myr, all without backup. But he was also known as the Arrogant, because his pride knew no limitations. The Storm King was the only Westerosi ruler that involved himself with the affairs of the East during the Century of Blood. No doubt his victory in the disputed lands made him feel larger than his contemporaries, but it also gave Aegon Targaryen the perfect excuse to introduce himself to the world. He did it with his greatest weapon and companion in life, Balerion. The Black Dread had easily spent 3/4 of a century of his life on Dragonstone before Aegon claimed him. We get 2 separate descriptions of his Moor, and while both come consecutively, we think they're more progressive in nature. In Chapter 13 of A Game of Thrones, Tyrion Lannister recalls seeing Balerion's skull, and it was large enough to swallow an aurochs whole, or even one of the hairy mammoths of Ibn. Both of these creatures are large extinct species, with the aurochs being the progenitor of bulls and the mammoth preceding elephants. But while they're both massive in their own right, the size difference between an aurochs and a mammoth is not negligible. On average, an aurochs stands somewhere between 1.5 and 2 meters in height. A mammoth is twice that size at least, and it's said that dragons keep growing until they die. So it's safe to assume that the time Aegon claimed him, Balerion had a maw that could swallow anything 2 meters tall without struggling, which is pretty terrifying to think of when you consider that that isn't even his entire body. In humans, the head-to-body ratio is 1:8, but in many reptiles, that number is significantly higher. Considering that Martin created his world to be as realistic as possible for a fantasy series, it isn't a stretch to imagine that his reptilian dragons would have head-to-body ratios similar to real-life reptiles. It's said that Balerion's wings could cover entire towns in its shadows, and that would only be possible if his body was several meters in length. Combine that with the fact that his flames had the power to melt steel like candles, and you have the world's most powerful portable flamethrower that comes in black on your hands. Argilac had entered the war against Volantis with a formidable force that was composed of several hundred men. Aegon Targaryen took only one troop with him for the entire length of his involvement, the Black Dread. After accepting an alliance with Pentos and Tyrosh, the Targaryen lord flew to the island of Lys, which was rebelling against Volantine control. The oldest daughter of Valyria had sent a fleet to reclaim its lost territory, but just off the shores of Lys, said fleet ran into Balerion's flames, thus ending Volantis' Lysine campaign. A single man had managed to defeat an entire fleet in one engagement, and though that man rode the world's largest dragon, it was enough for him to earn every other ruler's respect and envy. When Aegon returned to Dragonstone, he was contacted by Argilac Durrandon himself, who offered him an alliance which was to be sealed with marriage. And this is where the conquest begins. Aegon knew that for his conquest to be successful, he'd have to deal with the 2 kingdoms that had a stronghold on the heart of Westeros with a firm hand. Dragonstone was situated in Blackwater Bay, whose shores were contested territory. For 300 years, the Riverlands had been under the control of the Storm Kings of Storm's End before Hoare House of the Iron Islands drove them away. The Ironborn established a firm grasp over the Riverlands through endless campaigns, and by the time Aegon claimed Balerion, the ruler Harren, the king of the Isles and Rivers, had begun construction on the biggest seat of power the Western world would ever see. More on that a bit later, but we bring up this conflict to highlight how ridiculous Argilac's proposal to Aegon really was. In it, he promised the Dragon Lord lands that were held by the Ironborn, claiming them lost districts under Stormlander jurisdiction that were meant to be returned to them any day now. The arrogant Storm King was afraid of Harrenhal's power more than Aegon Targaryen's, but the latter's performance during the Daughters' War must have made him hopeful of an alliance. Plus, if Aegon accepted his terms, it'd create a buffer between the Ironborn and himself. Many lords of Westeros had assumed that Aegon, or rather the Targaryens in general, were not interested in their lands. Argilac must have been one of those lords, because he'd hoped Aegon would bite on the bait. That didn't happen, because the Dragon Lord responded with a counter-proposal asking the Storm King for Stormlander territory and offering his bastard brother's hand in exchange of his own, considering the fact that he was already married. Argilac had heard of the rumors surrounding Orys Baratheon's birth, so he rejected Aegon's request in the most hostile way imaginable, by sending him the severed hands of the envoy that brought him his message. For the Lord of Dragonstone, this Belai was Casus enough to call his banners. Aegon sent out ravens to all the high kings of the 7 kingdoms, making his intention of unifying their seats known, and was joined in his efforts by anywhere between a few hundred to 3,000 men at first. But that number was irrelevant because he and his sister wives had dragons. Aegon landed Balerion atop the highest hill near the Blackwater Rush, and after commissioning the construction of the Aegon Fort as his seat of power, rode him into his first test as a young king. His sister wives Visenya and Rhaenys had ensured the most bloodless surrenders of nearby Rosby and Stokeworth, which brought up his army's numbers closer to that 3,000 mark, but they were challenged by the combined might of Maidenpool and Duskendale, 2 of the biggest port cities in the Crown Lands. House Mouton and House Darklyn fielded over 3,000 troops and marched on Aegon, who responded by giving command of his marching troops to Orys and heading into battle himself atop Balerion. The Black Dragon reduced much of the Mouton and Darklyn army to ash and bone, and Lords Mouton and Darklyn lost their lives as well. It's unknown whether he swallowed any riders whole, horse and all, but his impact during Aegon's first test can't be denied. House Mouton and House Darklyn had long histories as kings, and the latter was the owner of the richest port city in the heart of Westeros. Maybe he could have secured victory the conventional way by relying on Orys's military genius, but with Balerion, Aegon established himself as a credible threat far quicker. The new leaders of Houses Mouton and Darklyn were quick to submit to his rule, as were a dozen other local castles, which officially gave Aegon territorial claim over mainland Westeros. He was crowned by his sister wife Visenya, and once the Targaryens unfurled their official standard and revealed their official words, they got back to business. The Conqueror divided his newly built army into 3 major divisions, all of which moved out at about the same time. The first was a fleet, commanded by Aegon's Admiral Daemon Velaryon and his wife Visenya, which was sent to capture the Vale of Arryn via Gulltown. The second was the bulk of Aegon's army, which crossed the Blackwater into Stormlands territory, with the intention of defeating Argilac the Arrogant. You'd think Aegon would lead this force personally given the history they have, but no. He delegated this responsibility to his other sister wife Rhaenys and his hand of the King Orys, because he was focused on what he considered to be the biggest challenge of his conquest. The day Aegon landed atop the hill that would soon be named after him, construction on the largest castle in Westeros was completed. If you looked at the continent's map from a bird's eye view, you'll notice that at its heart lies the God's Eye Lake. It was at the northern shore of this lake that Harrenhal, king of the Iron Islands and the Riverlands, erected a castle that he thought would solidify his and his house's legacy as conquerors for generations to make. Instead, it became a warning of what would happen if he provoked the wrath of the dragon. The burning of Harrenhal, how Balerion became the Black Dread. Aegon Targaryen's conquest has been made out to seem like some sort of fairy tale crusade, when the truth of the matter is, the aspiring High King of Westeros had many challenges he needed to overcome in order to see it through. Aegon was aware of the fact that people all across the world knew of Valyria's dark and bloody history. They wouldn't trust dragon lords easily out in the west where they were unfamiliar with their ways, and that'd be even more difficult for him to accomplish with 3 massive dragons at his disposal. As magical and wondrous as they are, the first word associated with dragons is dangerous. People don't obey a dragon lord because of trust alone, it's also fear. But if Aegon wanted to establish a long-lasting dynasty, he needed more of the former. So, how do you make people trust you more than they fear you? You take out someone they distrust even more, which in case of the Riverlands was Harrenhal. House Hoare had only held the Riverlands for 3 generations. Harren's grandfather won them from the Storm Kings, but by the time young Harren ascended to the throne, he'd already developed grand notions of his kingship and legacy. Harrenhal's nickname was Harren the Black, because he was a bloody tyrant that beggared both of his realms to complete the construction of his monstrous seat. 40 years it took for Harren's workers to build the gigantic fortress that is Harrenhal. The largest castle in the Western world, it had 5 towers that were twice the height of Winterfell's Great Keep. Its gatehouse was as large as the Great Keep. Its hall of 100 hearths was larger than the Great Keep. Martin really liked using Winterfell for scale when it came to Harrenhal. We're just realizing. But Winterfell is massive in the books, so you can imagine how huge Harrenhal must be to dwarf it. Its godswood alone was 20 acres. That's 20 football fields worth of trees and weirwoods. It's said that Harrenhal's walls were so tall that the scorpions on their battlements looked like their namesake. And if nothing we've said so far has given you an idea of its scale, well, that should do it. The day Aegon landed atop Aegon's Hill, Harrenhal moved into Harrenhal with all his family and retainers, surely intending to rule out of that castle for decades. His occupation wouldn't last for a quarter of the year. As soon as Aegon had his forces organized, he marched toward Harrenhal, which was easier now that the lands on its borders were his. That isn't to say the engagement itself was a piece of cake, because it wasn't. The Dragon King fought 2 battles with the Hoares before descending upon the castle. The first, called the Battle of Reeds, took place on the southern shore of the God's Eye, parallel to where Harrenhal stood. Aegon didn't involve Balerion in this fight because he only wanted to use him as a last resort. With his victory over House Mouton and House Darklyn, he'd shown the realm how easy it would be for him to just burn everything. But that's something a tyrant would do. A ruler only uses his greatest weapon as a last resort, and Aegon was doing just that by holding Balerion back. The Targaryens won the Battle of the Reeds with military tactic as opposed to crushing strength, though the Ironborn gave them a run for their money because the Ironborn fight like demons. However, they suffered massive casualties in the ambush attack dubbed the Wailing Willows, where Harren's sons crossed the God's Eye Lake using boats with muffled oars and killed a sizable portion of Aegon's army before making their getaway. The Dragon Lord had taken the honorable path and not unleashed Balerion upon Harren's soldiers. Now that things were getting dirty, he had no other choice. Aegon fired back on the Wailing Willow's ambush by burning Harren's retreating sons to death with Balerion. He then marched on Harrenhal with the remnants of his army and the new faces of the defecting Riverlanders, who were now joining up with him to go against Harren. They were sick and tired of being treated inhumanely, and seeing Aegon's 3-headed dragon banner gave them hope. Lord Edmund Tully of Riverrun was the first to defect, and soon Aegon's numbers blew up to 8,000, where he'd started this campaign with less than half that number. But the amount of manpower he had truly didn't make a difference, because no conventional siege could ever break Harrenhal without bankrupting the besiegers or wiping them out. The castle's walls were so thick, the main gateway had 12 murder holes as it led into the inner courtyard. 12 murder holes! Just think about that. And Harrenhal was thrice the size of Winterfell in its total surface area, which, and we're being honest here, isn't something a measly 8,000 men can expect to successfully besiege. Aegon had always known he'd have to use Balerion to send a message that would shake the cobwebs out of the ears of other Westerosi rulers, and Black Harren's folly had given him the perfect opportunity. When the Dragon King parleyed with the Black King regarding a surrender, he told Harren he'd let him rule the Iron Islands if he just went back and left the Riverlands alone. Harren refused, thinking his legacy would be enough to keep Aegon's men out and his dragon away. He clearly didn't know jack about Valyrian history or architecture, because if he did, he wouldn't have said something as stupid as "stone doesn't burn" to a Targaryen. For thousands of years, the Valyrians had used dragon flame and sorcery to melt and shape stone like clay. Dragonstone was fashioned in the form of hundreds of dragons using that same sorcery. Harren's arrogance and ignorance revealed itself when he put his faith in his stone walls against Balerion's black breath, and that would turn out to be his last mistake. In an exchange that's since become iconic in the annals of Westerosi history, Aegon informs Harren that when night comes, his line shall end. And then it does. At nightfall, the Dragon King mounts Balerion and flies him high up into the sky. Aegon needed to ensure that his assault on Harrenhal was swift and devastating. Though his army had increased in size, he didn't want to gamble the lives of the lords whose loyalties now hung in the balance. He wanted to tip the scales in his favor with one swift demonstration of power to let the whole realm know what happens if you mess with the Targaryens. And Balerion was crucial to this goal. Black Dragon ascended the skies with his bonded rider until he became nothing more than a needlehead in the sky. He then descended with insane speed before the defenders of Harrenhal had a chance to react, set them ablaze with jets of black fire streaked with red, the color of blood. Harren might have thought that his walls would keep him safe from dragon fire, clearly didn't think about fortifying his inner defenses. He didn't think of putting flammable resources in the vast underground cellars of Harrenhal, nor did he command his people to take shelter come night. Dragon descending on a castle is the equivalent on an air raid on a city in the modern context. Anything that gets caught above ground will burn, until nothing is left, except dragonfire will also melt the buildings that bombs usually just destroy. As soon as Balerion let loose his fire, everything flammable in the inner courtyard of Harrenhal caught flame, living and inanimate alike. While a mini firestorm raged in the open spaces of the castle, Balerion turned his attention to its towers, because that's where Harren's kin were most likely to be. As the night progressed, the dragon kept up its assault on Harrenhal and turned its 5 towers into melting black candles. The river lords who witnessed this and had reservations about pledging allegiance to Aegon lost any such thought witnessing Balerion's destructive black breath. Come morning, Black Harren's line was ended, as Aegon promised, and the Riverlands liberated from the yoke of the Ironborn. Thanks to his efforts at Harrenhal, news spread all across Westeros of the burning of Harrenhal. Its catalyst, Balerion the Black Dread. When Argilac Durandon heard of Harren's overnight fall from grace, he decided not to follow in his footsteps and meet Rhaenys and Orys in the field. However, he too met the same fate when Meraxes burned his armies and Orys slew him. Visenya's invasion of the Vale via Gulltown had failed, because the Arryns destroyed the Targaryen fleet. Vhagar burnt the Arryn fleet in response, and Harrenhal's burning inspired the men of Crackclaw Point to surrender to Targaryen rule without opposition. With the Crownlands, the Stormlands, and the Riverlands firmly within his grasp, Aegon turned his gaze westward and met the next major obstacle of his conquest from Balerion's back: the Field of Fire and the Iron Throne. Harrenhal and Argilac Durandon falling to Aegon and his dragon in quick succession sent alarm bells ringing across the rest of the Seven Kingdoms. The Vale of Arryn and the Dornish marches were fortified with armies, and the north started the long and arduous process of gathering her men. The first 2 were defense measures, and the third would take a lot of time. So Aegon turned his attention to his immediate concern: the 2 kings of the West. King Lorne Lannister of Casterly Rock and King Mern Gardner of Highgarden struck up an alliance to oppose Aegon and gathered the largest army the Western world had seen in recorded history. 50,000 Westermen and Reachmen marched underneath the watchful eyes of House Lannister, House Gardner, and House Oakhart. This number could have been greater had Oldtown joined the host, but Lord Hightower had been advised by the High Septon to not engage Aegon lest he brings the wrath of the dragon upon the faith, and so he remained neutral. Mern, who was the 9th of his name amongst the centuries-long line of Gardner kings, met with Lorne's forces at Golden Grove, which lies at the border between the Westerlands and the Reach. From there, the pair marched northeast towards Stony Sept, which is where Aegon reconvened with his sister wives. The Dragon King commanded a 5th of the 2 kings' numbers because most of his forces were scattered, but he had the advantage of having 3 dragons and the weather on his side. The 2 armies met on the plains north of Bitterbridge, where the Blackwater Rush enters mainland Westeros and makes its way towards the God's Isle. Aegon had his soldiers take up a defensive crescent formation and await the charge of the combined Lannister and Gardner army. When they got close enough, Aegon unleashed all 3 of his dragons onto them, and Balerion fought alongside Vhagar and Meraxes for the first and only time during the Wars of the Conquest. The Black Dread and his sisters were responsible for killing 4,000 Westermen and Reachmen, inflicting burn injuries upon 10,000 others. Because the Targaryen forces were stationed upwind, they weren't affected by the dragon flame, and were able to pick out stragglers with relative ease. Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes ended the Gardner line with their fires, because most of Mern Gardner's male kin died during the battle, and the one that survived succumbed to his injuries 3 days later. King Lorne escaped and submitted to Aegon the next day, and the Conqueror secured the bloodless surrender of the Gardner seat of Highgarden, naming its stewards, the Tyrells, new Wardens of the South. Before he could march on Oldtown, Aegon rushed back to the Riverlands because another major battle awaited him near the Red Fork. While he was burning his enemies on the Field of Fire, The North was able to rally together 30,000 men and cross the neck into Targaryen territory, intent on fighting to preserve their freedom. The Northmen were fewer than the Gardner Lannister host, but they were arguably far more vicious, and some of them were mad enough to try and fight Aegon despite seeing the size of Balerion. However, once the Dragon King and his Black Dread amassed their new army of soldiers and lords from 4 of the 7 kingdoms, Torrhen Stark knew that fighting Aegon would be wasteful. His scouts had seen Balerion's handiwork at Harrenhal and reported the horror of it back to him. He'd heard of the extinction of House Gardner at the Field of Fire, which brought up the tally of ancient houses the Dragon King had extinguished to 3. Torrhen's bastard brother Brandon wanted to sneak into the Targaryen camps and try and kill Aegon's dragons, but the king saw the folly of that approach and decided on peace instead. After a night of negotiations, Torrhen Stark knelt at Aegon's feet, gave up his crown, and rose as his Warden of the North. With 5 of the 7 kingdoms in his grasp, Balerion flew Aegon to Old Town to complete his conquest of the Reach. The Dragon King must have expected some resistance to bring his Black Dread to the oldest city in the Western Hemisphere, but instead what he found were open gates and a lord willing to submit to his rule without objection. At some point he'd sent his sister Visenya over to the Vale to negotiate their surrender, and with those negotiations being a success as well, Aegon was coroneted 3 days after his arrival in Old Town. The dragon was proclaimed the King of the Andals, the Rhoynar and the First Men, as well as the protector of the realm. Aegon rode Balerion through Old Town's streets as the people cheered on his coronation, his objective of positioning himself as the benevolent dragon-riding liberator achieved. Balerion could have just as easily set Old Town ablaze had the Hightowers not made the decision to bend the knee, and because they did, they were spared from being turned into Harrenhal 2.0. The Black Dread was next flown into battle 2 years after Aegon's coronation, when he went to the Iron Islands to put down a succession struggle that could turn out to be rebellious. 5 rival kings warred with one another for close to a year in the aftermath of House Hall's downfall, painting the salt waters of the Iron Islands red with blood. Aegon dispatched 3 separate fleets and a contingent of longships from Bear Island to put an end to the conflict, while he flew upon Balerion's back. The Dragon King landed on Great Wick with Balerion and slew the most troublesome of the 5, Corin Volmark, in a duel. The rest of the Ironborn gave up pretty soon after that, and instead of burning them with Balerion for treason, Aegon allowed them to choose a new leader from their own. With the subjugation of about 80% of Westeros' landmass achieved, Aegon took to his new capital of King's Landing and spent 2 years governing the realm from the newly constructed Iron Throne. The throne, made from the swords of his fallen enemies, was a symbol of Targaryen power, but also the burden that came with it. The Conqueror had no back built into the seat, as he believed that a king should never rest easy. Besides, if anyone tried, they'd get impaled upon one of its many spikes, unlike the HBO version where that's practically impossible. The singers claim that Balerion helped forge the Iron Throne with his own breath, but this is unlikely considering how hot his flames are. The Black Dread melted thousands of fully armored men and 5 massive towers made of thick slabs of black stone like they were candles. The laborers of Westeros weren't the sorcerers of Valyria who could control dragon flame with their magic, so Balerion's involvement in the forging of the Iron Throne is likely an exaggeration. But what isn't is his involvement in the rest of Aegon's life and the one campaign that he could never complete on his own terms, the War for Dorne. First Dornish War and Aegon's death. After she secured the Stormlands with their bastard brother, Aegon sent his queen Rhaenys to Dorne to replicate her success. But instead of finding open resistance or submission, what she found was tension. Rhaenys found every Dornish city devoid of fighting men, and when she came to the capital city of Sunspear, the Princess of Dorne warned her to return at her own peril. Rhaenys does just that 4 years after Aegon's coronation, when she descends upon Planky Town with a dragon and sets it ablaze. The Targaryens launch a 3-fold invasion of Dorne toward the end of Wars of the Conquest. Aegon leads a host of Reachmen into the Prince's Pass, his aunt Orys leads another host into the Bone Way with his Stormlander troops, and Rhaenys takes to the skies. Valerion's kept in the background because Aegon wants the Dornish to see that he isn't a merciless ruler. If he used the Black Dread from the offset, it would have damaged his reputation in Dorne and made it worse than it already was, and he couldn't exactly afford that. The Valerians had forced their Rhoynish ancestors to feel their mother and migrate halfway across the globe to escape their dragons. House Martell, which can trace its lineage to the Rhoynar Queen Nymeria, would never accept Targaryen rule on their terms, and using dragons in the war would only prove her point. Rhaenys only burned Planky Town because every siege she'd encountered on her flight had been pretty much abandoned by everyone. So was the case for most of the places Aegon and Balerion besieged. The Targaryens would always make some headway, only to find out it was pointless because their enemies had no political value of their own. Women, children, old men, and mad fools were being sent out as defenders, and after a while, Aegon got frustrated with the cat-and-mouse games. He mounted Balerion, joined up with Rhaenys, flew to Sunspear and upon finding it abandoned as well, claimed it as part of his conquest. He erected his standard, named Lord Rosby the castle's castellan and the Warden of the Sands, and headed back to King's Landing with the Black Dread. His first offensive was a disaster because not only did he not get his hands on any enemies of note, he also ended up losing his hand of the king to the dastardly Will of Will, who kept Orys in prison for 3 years. When the Dornish launched their guerrilla campaign and took back all the territory the Targaryens had captured, Aegon escalated things to full-scale warfare and brought Balerion into play. For 2 years, Aegon and his sister wives descended upon the sands of Dorne with dragonfire, but all of their efforts were in vain. 9 years after his coronation, Aegon lost his wife Rhaenys to the Dornish when she was brought down alongside her dragon Meraxes by the Ullars of Hellholt. For 2 years following Rhaenys' death, Balerion and Vhagar laid waste to every Dornish castle that wasn't Sunspear many times over. Hellholt, the site of Rhaenys' death, was burnt with fire so hot that the sand surrounding its walls turned to glass. The Black Dread would visit his rider's wrath upon the remnants of the Rhoynar many times over, but ultimately, time won out. In the year 13 AC, Princess Meria Martell of Dorne passed away, and her son sent peace terms to King's Landing alongside Meraxes' skull. After reading the prince's terms, Aegon flew Balerion back to Dragonstone for the night and returned next morning, accepting them. The Black Dread would revisit the Sons of Dorne only once following the conclusion of Aegon's wars, and not to turn them to glass, but to feast the friendship between Sunspear and King's Landing. Once Aegon had accepted that the extent of his realm would remain bound to 6 kingdoms for now, he got to work on keeping them unified, and Balerion had a major role to play in this. The second half of the Dragon King's reign saw him make numerous royal progresses to the many corners of his vast new kingdom, and Aegon would always bring Balerion with him. The Black Dread's presence not only ensured his safety, but also inspired wonder and terror within his subjects. The Targaryens were well aware of the fact that the realm was young and could only be held together by a firm hand. Balerion inspired loyalty and fear, both of which were necessary for their dynasty to successfully establish itself on Westeros. He flew to the capital of each of Aegon's new kingdoms, and other castles and towns that were important in those regions. Balerion's wings went from the Arbor to the Eyrie, from Storm's End to Pike, and from Highgarden to Winterfell. That last one was also the final royal progress Aegon made personally in the 33rd year of his reign. Balerion had been to the north 5 times, but all those visits had been restricted to White Harbour and Barrowton. When Aegon took him to Winterfell, he became the only creature in the world to have visited both Winterfell and Valyria, 2 pillars of opposing kinds of power. The Black Dread remained fairly unchallenged in the second half of Aegon's reign, considering the dragon's peace was holding, but that was about to change real soon. 37 years after his coronation in Old Town, King Aegon Targaryen passed away due to a stroke in his home at Dragonstone. When a dragon's bonded rider passes away, they can sense it, and Balerion was the same. With his previous master of over 50 years gone, the Black Dread waited to see who would claim him next, and it turned out to be a man that could match his reputation in the worst way possible. The fire that burned the faith. Balerion the Black Dread and Maegor the Cruel. Aegon Targaryen had one son with each of his sister wives. His first son, Aenys, was born to Rhaenys, and was the first Targaryen prince of Westeros. His second son, Maegor, was born to Visenya, and while Aenys was a soft-spoken man, Maegor was the definition of hardness. A born warrior, the Dragon Prince was obsessed with battle and power, and though he'd seen 24 name days by the time his father passed away, he'd never claimed a dragon of his own. This wasn't for a lack of dragons. Following the conquest, there were several hatchlings in the hatcheries of Dragonstone, and it was from those hatchlings that Maegor's brother Aenys chose his dragon, Quicksilver. But the Conqueror's second son had his eye on the Conqueror's steed, which is why Maegor chose to remain dragonless until Aegon's death. Once his father passed away, the prince claimed Balerion as his dragon, and together they should have been called the Dreadful Duo or something along those lines. Maegor's brother Aenys was a courtly man, but he was an extremely weak king. During his reign, 4 separate rebellions sprang up, and while 3 of them were orchestrated by upstart outlaws and priests, one of them had been staged by a great house. In the Vale, Lord Ronald Arryn's younger brother Jonos threw his brother through the moon door and declared himself king of the Vale. Though he had few supporters, Aenys' response to this proclamation was less than competent, and while the local lords managed to pen Jonas and his supporters up in the Eyrie, the seat of House Arryn and the Warden of the East was effectively being held hostage. For his first act as Balerion's new rider, Prince Maegor flew the Black Dread to the Eyrie and put down the Arryn rebellion personally. Jonas' supporters had heard of Maegor's flight and were terrified of Balerion, so they threw him to his death. That saved them from the Black Dread's fires, but it didn't save them from Maegor's justice. The prince hanged every last co-conspirator of the Arryn rebellion he could get his hands on, thereby doing what his brother should have done and stamping out rebellion against the Targaryens. Aenys named Maegor his hand after this performance, and for a couple of years, the 2 brothers ruled rather competently, until Maegor's decision to marry again got in between them. The second son of Aegon the Conqueror had been married for over a decade before he was named hand, and yet he hadn't sired a child. Maegor decided his problem would be solved by taking another bride, but Aenys objected, out of fear of an uprising by the Faith of the Seven. In the end, he issued an ultimatum to Maegor to either set aside his second wife or go into exile for 5 years, and the prince chose the latter option. He flew Balerion to Pentos with his new wife, and for 2 years, the skies of Westeros were free of the Black Dread. But this also meant that the Targaryens lost all the symbols of power that Aegon had established with him. Maegor was the wielder of Blackfire, Aegon's sword. He was the rider of Balerion, Aegon's dragon. Many in the realm saw Aenys as weak, including Maegor himself, so the prince must have known that it would only be a matter of time before his foolish brother got himself killed. When that finally happened 2 years into his exile, Maegor returned to Westeros upon Balerion's back and set about reminding the Westerosi why the latter was called the Black Dread. The prince usurped his nephew's throne and proclaimed himself king, taking his father's crown in favor of his brother's more ornate one. Maegor flew Balerion to King's Landing and landed atop Visenya's hill, where he erected the Targaryen standard. The capital of Westeros had been quite chaotic since Maegor's brother Aenys decided to wed his children in defiance of the faith's doctrines. Incest and polygamy, things that were normal for Valyrians like the Targaryens, were heresies in the eyes of the faith. So Aenys had his family shifted to Dragonstone before his death, and as a result, both the Sept of Remembrance and the Red Keep had fallen in the hands of the Stars and Swords. Visenya's hill was all that remained to him, so he waited for supporters to flock to him so he could face the over 700-strong force of warriors' sons within the city. Maegor was challenged by the Grand Captain of the Warriors' Sons, Daemon Morrigan, and after a trial of 7, he emerged victorious. But a blow to the head put Maegor in a temporary coma, and when he woke up, without saying a word, he flew Balerion to the Sept of Remembrance and burnt it to ashes. Maegor had his forces kill off any stragglers and survivors from the Black Dread's flames, and this was just the first act of fiery retaliation from the king who would be remembered as the Cruel. Balerion took flight in the Battle of the Great Fork, where Maegor's royal army defeated a faith militant force of 20,000 men. The Black Dread burnt several scores of them to a crisp, despite rain impeding his movements. The king pulled back from warfare for a few months to oversee the construction of the reclaimed Red Keep. But once he was done ensuring it had progressed to where he could attend to other matters, he mounted Balerion once again. This time, Maegor flew the dragon westward and set alight the seats of several faith-aligned houses like House Lorch, House Doggett, House Folwell, and House Broom, to name a few. Aegon had used Balerion to impress the power of Dragonlords upon Westerosi nobles and unite them with it. Maegor used the Black Dread to make sure that they remembered who was boss by inspiring fear in their hearts. After burning multiple castles of faith-sensitive houses in the Westerlands, Maegor turned Balerion towards Old Town, threatening to burn the seat of his first wife's noble house alongside his mother and her dragon Vhagar. Instead, he found open gates and a high septon that was far more agreeable in the face of dragons than his predecessor. The king spent the next few months in Old Town with Balerion, presiding over trials and disbanding the faith militant from their seat of power within Old Town. Maegor sent most of the warriors' sons in Old Town to the wall, and those who resisted his sentence were executed. His anointment by the High Septon brought most of the great houses back into his fold, and by the time Maegor finished holding court in Old Town, he must have expected to return to a semblance of peace. However, as he closed in on finishing one chapter of his tumultuous reign, another began almost immediately. Battle beneath the God's Eye, Balerion versus Quicksilver, and a preview of Daemon versus Aemon from House of the Dragon. While Maegor and Balerion were in Old Town, King's Landing remained devoid of any meaningful Targaryen presence. The city's defenses were strong, but its people were frustrated with Maegor's cruelty, and they were aching to help anyone that could take him down, which allowed his nephew and niece to sneak in and fly out of the city upon Dragonback. Rhaena was already a dragon rider before she was forced into exile, so she reunited with Dreamfire, but her husband Aegon claimed his father's mount, Quicksilver. Without a dragon, Aegon the Uncrowned's claim had been forgotten by most lords, but with his father's dragon underneath him, he gained legitimacy in the eyes of Westerosi lords. Well, that, and it gave him a fighting chance against Maegor's dragons. Or so they thought. Prince Aegon was a young and bold man, but he had his father's ill temperance. When he raised his banners at Pink Maiden, many major and minor houses answered the call, but none of the great houses got involved, and in the end, his army only numbered up to 15,000. Maegor had the support of many houses in and around Aegon's army, and more than that, he had the greatest dragon in Westerosi history. By the time the uncle and nephew crossed paths in battle, Balerion had crossed 150 years of age. His jaws were probably closer to that woolly mammoth swallowing size we mentioned a few segments ago, and facing him in battle with human troops alone was the height of folly. When Aegon got 2 dragons on his side, his supporters gained heart because at least they had a way to fight back now. Quicksilver was a quarter of the size of Balerion and Dreamfire was smaller still. Combined, they might have outpaced him with their speed. Quicksilver and Dreamfire were speed-type dragons. Had the prospective king and queen had experience in riding dragons, they could have teamed up on Balerion and at least done some damage. But that wasn't to be. Aegon decided to leave Rhaena at Pink Maiden and command his army personally, but he marched them to their dooms. At one point, they would be set by enemy forces from 3 sides, but instead of breaking his troops and dealing with each individual threat, Aegon wanted to advance on the capital alone. His soldiers ran into the Targaryen army, which was a third of their size, but contained a massive advantage in Balerion. When Aenys mounted Quicksilver, Maegor descended upon him with the Black Dread, and what followed wasn't even a fight. It was a one-sided slaughter. Balerion used its sheer size advantage to swoop down on Quicksilver and rip off one of its wings, leaving it and Aegon to plummet to the deaths. This might have been a small skirmish, but it was a major event in the annals of history because it was the first time dragon fought dragon in Westeros. The Valyrian freehold was a mighty world polity that ruled for thousands of years, but they weren't exactly united all the time. 40 families would fight constantly to rise in power, and so naturally, dragons fighting dragons must have been a common sight near the 14 Flames. But this was the first time such a thing occurred in Westeros, and Balerion vs. Quicksilver serves as a preview for another legendary uncle-nephew dragon fight, that being Daemon and Caraxes vs. Aemond and Vhagar. This might be a little spoilerific, but it's not like HBO hasn't hyped up this fight. Right, Vhagar vs. Caraxes is the #1 dragon battle that everyone wants to see, and it parallels the fight between Balerion and Quicksilver in more than one way. Sure, if you want to talk about the action itself, Balerion vs. Quicksilver was more like Vhagar vs. Arrax, except even Arrax managed to get in more licks than Quicksilver. But in terms of symbolism, Daemon and Aemond follow a path very similar to Maegor and Aegon. For starters, they're both men that are in line to sit upon the Iron Throne. Daemon is Rhaenyra's king consort now, so if she takes the throne, he becomes what he's always wanted to become. Aemond isn't too far behind in the line of succession. Sure, Aegon has heirs of his own, but Aemond's aspirations to become king are plain as day. He won't usurp his brother's throne, but if things were to happen that could speed up his path to it, then he wouldn't get in their way. You can bet on that. And moreover, if Aegon were to lose his children, which is very likely based on what happens in Fire and Blood, Aemond would become his heir. It's a convoluted path to the throne, but it isn't unlikely, which makes both uncle and nephew aspirants to the Iron Throne. The size difference is swapped in this context as the nephew has the larger dragon. Vhagar in House of the Dragon is said to be as big as Balerion was at the time of the Conquest, and Caraxes is half that size. But what he lacks in size, he makes up for in experience, and the fact that Daemon Targaryen is far more used to riding a dragon than Maegor's nephew, Aegon, ever was. Aegon had only recently claimed Quicksilver. Even Lucerys had more airtime with Arrax than Aegon did with Quicksilver. That and the fact that Balerion was simply the largest creature in existence made his defeat inevitable. It's unclear whether Maegor involves Balerion in his campaign following the battle beneath the God's Eye, which is paralleled by Daemon and Aemon's battle above the God's Eye, which takes place over Harrenhal. Yeah, George Martin really likes layering in events over the course of the centuries, and expect many things in the Caraxes vs. Vhagar battle to be callbacks to Balerion's slaughtering of Quicksilver, symbolically speaking, of course. But let's get back to what we were saying about it being unclear what Balerion does after killing Quicksilver. Maegor sets out on 2 notable campaigns following the killing of his nephew, which earned him his nickname the Cruel. The first is to stamp House Harroway out of existence, and the second is the capture and burn a faith militant leader called Poxy Jane Poor. Both campaigns are successful, but Balerion's involvement is mentioned in neither. Both the World of Ice and Fire and Blood make these campaigns seem like regular war campaigns, so we're gonna just assume Maegor rode Balerion into those conflicts at the very least. The point of the Black Dread during his reign wasn't to keep the lands united through strength, it was to keep them united through fear, and Maegor the Cruel had shown Westeros just how destructive Balerion's flames could be, in case they'd forgotten Harrenhal in the Field of Fire. The base template of what had happened if Aerys Targaryen had a dragon ran roughshod over the continent for the next 5 years, trying to keep it consolidated through tyranny and the terror of the Black Dread. But eventually, Maegor's actions caught up with him and put Balerion in a unique position for the first time in nearly a century. Maegor's death and Balerion's first retirement. While King Maegor Targaryen has had a lot of success in his campaign against the Faith Militant, he'd suffered more losses politically speaking. The Faith Militant didn't stand alone in its fight against Targaryen abominations. Several houses from the Westerlands, the Riverlands, and the Reach had lent their support to the Swords and Stars, and many of those same houses backed Aegon the Uncrowned as well, despite knowing his chances of winning were mid at best. Maegor's constant wars had beggared the royal treasury, and his brutal suppression of the faith, as well as his genocide of House Harroway, had turned the realm against him. Not to mention his polygamous practices were making the royal court implode, because the more brides Maegor married, the lesser his chances of conceiving became. He got 2 out of his 3 black brides pregnant, but their children were stillborn monstrosities because they'd been poisoned by one of Maegor's other wives. He had Aenys' eldest surviving son Viserys as his permanent hostage, but his wife Alyssa and his other children Jaehaerys and Alysanne slipped his grasp when his mother Visenya died. In response, Maegor tortured Viserys to death and used his corpse as bait to draw out his family members, but it didn't work. Both Jaehaerys and Alysanne had dragons of their own in Vermithor and Silverwing, whom we'll see in action soon enough in House of the Dragon. While neither could have matched Ballerion's strength, Maegor's life ran out before he could retaliate against any of his enemies. Sensing his uncle's weakened position thanks to the many enemies he'd made, Jaehaerys announced his claim to the Iron Throne as the eldest surviving son of the previous legitimate king, Aenys Targaryen. Maegor called his banners in response, but few answered the call, as his nephew had the support of houses Baratheon, Lannister, Arryn, Tyrell, and even Tully, who had sided with Maegor against Jaehaerys' eldest brother, Aegon. The cruel king prepared for a grim war he wasn't sure he could win. Maegor conducted his war council with the head of one of his dissenting supporters mounted on a lance behind the Iron Throne. He had 4,000 men and Balerion against 3 dragons, thanks to his sister wife Rhaenyra's escape and most of the great houses of Westeros. When he was done making his plans, he stayed back in the throne room, brooding over his fate. The next morning, Maegor the Cruel was found impaled on the Iron Throne, and just like that, Balerion became riderless. For the first time in 48 years. There was truly no need for the Black Dread services. All the remaining Targaryens had dragons of their own, and the ones that didn't were too young to need them. The only dragonless Targaryens after Maegor's death were Rhaenyra's daughters, Aerea and Rhaella. Rhaella was training to become a scepter at Old Town. She was never going to become a dragon rider, and Princess Aerea was too young for a dragon when Maegor died. With no one to claim him and the dragon pit incomplete, Balerion flew back to the only home he'd known before he was ridden to war, Dragonstone. In King's Landing, Vermithor took his place as the terrifying royal mount of a Targaryen king, and the next 6 years of the Black Dread's life were spent in relative peace. He made himself a lair within the Dragonmont and ventured forth as and when he wished to. Jaehaerys had told everyone in his council and guards to not trifle with Balerion, for he was a willful beast. As long as he was left alone, he would cause no harm. But threatening the largest dragon in the world by exposing it to a presence that didn't understand it or its need for freedom could cause massive damage to the world. So, as Jaehaerys grew up in King's Landing, Balerion languished in Dragonstone, until one day he was claimed by a girl as willful as him. A willful princess and the Black Dread's flight back home. Balerion and Princess Aerea. Princess Aerea Targaryen was the daughter of Prince Aegon Targaryen and Queen Rhaenyra Targaryen. After her mother married Maegor the Cruel, Aerea was named the heir to the Iron Throne until a male heir was born to the king, and when Maegor died, that rolled over to Jaehaerys. When the young king came into power, he was not of age, and thereby couldn't sire children, legally speaking. He needed to appoint an heir apparent until such a time where he had a child of his own body, so Aerea was given that role, considering she was his only living blood relative from the next generation available for the post. For 3 years, the princess enjoyed the attention that came with being an heiress, but in the year 51 AC, all that changed. That year, Jaehaerys married his sister, Alysanne, in an official ceremony, and at the wedding, Aerea's mother Rhaenyra Targaryen demanded 2 things: Dragonstone as her seat, and Aerea returned to her care. Jaehaerys agreed to both requests because it was the least he could do for his sister who had suffered through so much grief. But for Aerea, this was her worst nightmare. She was a boisterous girl that enjoyed working with horses and chatting with the ladies of the court. At Dragonstone, there was no one her age, and all the people that were there were far older than her. She found it difficult to connect with anyone, including her mother, who was practically a stranger to her. Aerea became closer to her companion, Alyssa Farman, instead, and always wished to sail away with her into the Sunset Sea. The only respite she had were the dragons, for Aerea would visit the Dragonmont often, waiting for the day she could claim a dragon of her own. Then one day, after a fight with her mother, she stopped caring about permission and decided to go for the biggest dragon in the world, Balerion. As someone that was intimate with Dragonstone's pathways, especially the Dragonmonts, Aerea would have had no difficulty locating Balerion's lair within that smoky volcano. She'd often been described as a fiery young girl, and bonding with a dragon is what she was waiting to do for close to 3 years. During her time on Dragonstone, Aerea lost her smile and her status as heir to the throne, because in 53 AC, Jaehaerys' first healthy child was born. She felt like a prisoner to her mother's commands, and she had no way to escape apart from claiming a dragon. No doubt she thought that by going for Balerion, she could reclaim all that power she was losing over her own life. With the Black Dread underneath her, who would dare question her authority? But what she didn't consider was how willful Balerion would turn out to be, which, by the way, is far more than her. A dragon bond only works when the rider and the dragon are equals on a mental and spiritual level. Many Targaryens that became dragon riders were given their dragons in the crib as eggs, which then hatched into creatures they were bonded with for life. But the older a dragon got, the more difficult it was to tame it, which is going to become awfully clear during the dragon seed scenes of House of the Dragon. Aegon and Maegor could claim Balerion because they had exceptionally strong personalities and a sense of how these creatures worked. Aerea was 12 when she claimed the Black Dread, and unaware of most of the intricacies of the dragon bond, let alone its basic fundamentals. If the dragon you bond with has a stronger will than you, then it flies you. not the other way around, and Aeria discovered this in the most horrific way imaginable. Toward the end of 54 AC, she claimed Balerion and disappeared from Dragonstone for over a year. She'd been pining after King's Landing shortly before their fight, so her mother Rhaena flew there first in search of her. Aeria had always been fond of Alyssa and her dream about a legendary voyage, so Rhaena visited Fair Isle as well during her flight over the Seven Kingdoms. The Dragon Queen flew north and south, east and west, and found no trace of Aeria anywhere. Jaehaerys' council found this pretty odd considering Balerion was the largest dragon in the world, and easily recognizable to any Westerosi after 50 years of Targaryen rule. The conciliator's hand, Septon Barth, proposed that perhaps the pair flew east, and turns out he was correct. Over a year after he disappeared with Aeria upon his back, Balerion returned to Westeros from the east in a condition no one would have ever thought they'd see him in. The Black Dread was the most dangerous creature in the known world, bar none. His wings were so large that he could cover towns with them when he flew, and his flames had turned many armies and castles into ashes and melted stone. He was pretty much undefeated in battle for the majority of his life, yet here he was, sporting multiple half-healed injuries and a massive 9-foot gash on his left abdomen. On his back was Princess Aeria, who was barely alive and had been infested with what we can only call fiery facehuggers. The once lively and healthy princess was now gaunt and burning from the inside out, with several things moving about inside of her. Septon Barth records these things as being half-formed worm-like creatures that had vaguely humanoid appearances, and postulates that the only place Aeria and Balerion could have picked up their respective conditions was Valyria. Most of what Barth says is dismissed by the maesters who write Westerosi history because they're biased against him, but he has some of the most accurate information on rulership, Targaryens, and dragons in general. When the topic of Aeria's disappearance was broached at Jaehaerys' council, Barth was the one who said they might have gone east, and seeing Balerion's injuries itself must have confirmed his suspicions. The Black Dread's will was far stronger than Aeria Targaryen's, what with him being a century-and-a-half-old dragon and all. So, after their bond was confirmed, he flew her to the true home that his heart craved, Valyria. When Balerion arrived in Westeros, he was a young dragon and had spent only a few months in the fires of the 14 Flames. But by the time he was claimed by Aeria, he had grown old, and with old age comes the want for nostalgic warmth. When the princess couldn't decide on a destination, Balerion decided for them and went flying back to Valyria. But being a dragon, he couldn't have possibly predicted how the doom would have left that place looking like. Aeria was a Targaryen, so she could handle the heat of the destroyed peninsula, what neither of them accounted for with the magical creature still infesting it. The Valyrians were blood mages who didn't just use dragons in their dark arts. All sorts of chimeras and rare beasts were twisted by them to suit their needs, and these included the fireworms that dwell within the 14 Flames. There are several theories in the fandom that suggest these worms form the basis of the creation of dragons, because the worm-like creatures within Aeria are what inspired Barth to write dragons, worms, and wyverns, their unnatural history. This book's considered to be a highly controversial treatise on the birthing process of dragons by the Citadel in Old Town, so you know at least some of it must be true. Barth claims the Valyrians used wyvern stock to create dragons, but in order to infuse wyverns with fire, they'd need something like fireworms to do it. Just because Valyria collapsed doesn't mean all the fireworms died with it. It doesn't even necessarily mean that all the dragons died either. For the most part, dragons are content with layering around extremely hot places as long as they have space to grow and food to eat. The latter would be a more difficult prospect in a ruined land like Valyria, but it's possible that dragons survived the doom and continue to live there to this day, because otherwise the wound on Balerion's chest becomes extremely hard to explain. The Black Dread's skin was thick enough to stop steel, his teeth were solid like black diamonds, and his flames were the hottest of any Targaryen dragon. And yet he sported multiple injuries besides the smoking and bleeding gash on his left, which can mean one of two things. Either he got himself stuck inside of a Valyrian steel cage trap and cut himself trying to escape it, or he went up against something bigger than him and lost. Balerion was the strongest known creature for close to 2 decades. There was nothing in the world that could spook him into a retreat. But after a single year of being away from Westeros with Aeria, he returned to King's Landing, battered and bruised. King Jaehaerys decreed that Balerion would become the first inhabitant of the recently finished Dragon Pit, and from this point onward, the Black Dread enters a second retirement period. Balerion continues to grow as the years pass, but he also becomes lazier and moodier. For nearly 2 decades, he languishes in the Dragon Pit riderless, and by the time Jaehaerys' son Balon smacks him on the snout, Balerion has neither strength nor interest in retaliating. He grows so grotesquely huge that the Dragon Keepers start actively suggesting Targaryen children to avoid claiming him. The former Black Dread languishes in his lairs up until the year he stops growing, which is when the final significant event of his life takes place. Final claiming, death and legacy, how Balerion shapes the world of ASO-IAF even today. In the year 93 AC, Balerion was claimed by Jaehaerys' grandson Viserys Targaryen. In case you're wondering, yes, it's the same Viserys from Season 1 of House of the Dragon. At this time, the Black Dread had spent more than 2 centuries living on Planetos, and the last quarter of his life had been spent recuperating from injuries that would have killed him had he not returned. He'd become extremely difficult to rouse, and even when Viserys finally managed to make him take to the skies, Balerion could barely circle King's Landing 3 times. The prince had expressed his concerns about Balerion's health to his father, because his original intention was to fly the Black Dread to Dragonstone. But alas, dying at home wasn't in the cards for Balerion, who perished of natural causes a year after Viserys claimed him. The only reason the young prince bonded with Balerion, despite knowing full well how weak he'd become, was his desire to be seen as a great king. When Balerion died, he refused to take another dragon, which was perhaps his biggest mistake, because if he had, the Dance of the Dragons could have been avoided. In life, the Black Dread had been the most visible symbol of Targaryen power, so in death, he became a monument to remind the people of the same. Upon Balerion's passing, his skull was separated from his body, stripped of his flesh, cleansed to the bone, and put on display in the Targaryen throne room. The Targaryens had mounted the heads of several legendary dragons that were in their house on the wall surrounding the Iron Throne, but of the 19 that make it into Mad King Aerys' reign, only one has had world-changing impact. Following his death, Balerion's skull serves as a reminder of Targaryen strength, and that doesn't change even after it shifted to a basement cellar of the Red Keep. After the fall of the Targaryens, the new King Robert Baratheon wanted every trace of their presence purged from court, so he locked up their dragon skulls in the lower levels of the Red Keep. We see Balerion's skull through the eyes of 2 characters in the books, and both are utterly mesmerized and horrified by it at the same time. The first is Tyrion Lannister. After his sister became queen, Tyrion came to King's Landing on a royal visit and demanded that he be allowed to see the Targaryen dragon skulls. Robert agreed, and Tyrion got to inspect all 19 of them, including Balerion's. The Black Dread's teeth were like black iron daggers, and his mouth could have swallowed a supply wagon with no hesitation. This is the visit Tyrion recalls in Chapter 13 of A Game of Thrones, where he's thinking about his visit to Balerion's skull. And the second character we see encounter the Black Dread's legacy is Arya Stark, who ends up in front of it during the cat-chasing training. Martin really makes the dragon's head seem like an unfathomable monstrosity by having characters that are already quite short in stature be in its presence. But it works out in that we're impressed with Balerion long before we got any details about his life. George R.R. Martin's description of his severed head alone was so compelling that everything that came after it feels like a bonus. Though he died like a retired hurt soldier, Balerion had left a lasting enough impact on the world to become synonymous with Targaryen power and Aegon's conquest by the time the House of the Dragon timeline as well as the Game of Thrones timeline picks up. The latter pays even greater homage to him than the former's shrine-like dedication to him by adding a dragon that is his second coming. Nearly 200 years following his death, Balerion returns to the world in the form of Daenerys Targaryen's black dragon Drogon. Drogon's had less than half a decade to grow and prosper, so he isn't quite as massive as Balerion yet. But for all intents and purposes, Drogon was Balerion reincarnate. You can't deny that when a Dothraki man like Aegon says it to Drogon's mother's face. Drogon has the same jet black and scarlet colouring of Balerion on his scales and in his flames. At the end of A Dance with Dragons, his estimated wingspan is 20 feet, pretty massive for a dragon his age. He's the largest and the wildest of Dany's 3 dragons, and also the one she's personally bonded with, considering she rode him out of Meereen. It's safe to say that she was doing the rest of her conquering from Drogon's back, whenever the series resumes, and will no doubt cut the figure of Aegon the Conqueror reborn as a woman. But there's another poetic full circle moment awaiting her at the end of the series, once Dany finally involves herself with the White Walkers. According to what we've seen in House of the Dragon, Aegon passed down his dream of the White Walker invasion to his son, Aenys, who then passed it down to his son, Aegon, and started a secret tradition that Viserys has now passed on to his daughter Rhaenyra in House of the Dragon. Had the others arrived during Aegon's day, he could have burnt them with Balerion, but even 300 years after his coronation, the Conqueror's steed could fulfill his dream for him by living vicariously through the vessel that is Drogon. There's a sense of literary satisfaction that rolls over our brains every time we think about the fact that Martin started the conquest of Westeros with Balerion and will end it with him as well, because his stories are all about getting to full circle moments in the most convoluted ways possible. Where Balerion was the first Targaryen dragon that Westeros officially saw, Drogon could end up being its last if the books take the TV show route, without even featuring the character in his main story. George R.R. Martin has turned Balerion into an integral part of the fabric of Ice and Fire, and that's pretty freaking crazy if you ask us. Marvelous verdict. In his over 2 centuries-long lifespan, Balerion the Black Dread ended 3 ancient houses, burned the castles of many others, slaughtered thousands of men with his flames, turned Harrenhal into a living monument to Targaryen strength and fear. He was the largest dragon in the known world after the fall of Valyria, and when he died, his was the largest skull put on display in the Red Keep's throne room. which also had another piece that was alleged to be 3,000 years old. He was joined on the walls by Vhagar and Meraxes, but unlike those two, Balerion enjoys a pretty consistent reputation with the people of Planetos. All those who think of him or see his remains can't help but agree that he's the definition of might, and perhaps they even piss their pants a little, considering his size always felt like they were watching. The Black Dread shaped Targaryen perception in the first century of their rule, and he played both roles. Under Aegon, he was the fire that forged the Seven Kingdoms into one sword. Under Maegor, he was the flame that destroyed any opposition that dared to crop up against Targaryen rule. In both circumstances, his presence defined the lives of each king respectively, and the Targaryen dynasty collectively. If you had any doubts regarding that truth, we hope it's changed after getting acquainted with his entire life. Drop a like on this video and do share it with your fellow Throneheads this dragon season. We'll see you guys next time with another detailed breakdown of one of George Martin's genius creations. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.